SEP FanFic Readings presents Thanks to the Photographs by Unstable Hufflepuff. Chapter 6. An Unforgettable Birthday. Hermione practically sauntered into the Great Hall at dinner on Friday night. She had been able to get through entire lessons that day without interruption, and there were no more whispered comments or giggles at the back of the class, and her students only spoke when they had a question that pertained to the subject that they were currently studying. She could not have been more pleased. Draco eyed her warily from his seat next to her at the head table as she dug into her food, humming a gleeful little tune to herself. She caught his eye and beamed at him, which seemed to only further his suspicion. "What's got you so giddy, Hermione?" Veronica added from her other side, her brows raised. "Are you two actually shagging? Is that it?" At that precise moment, Draco had been taking a sip of his pumpkin juice and wound up choking on it, patting his back as he coughed and spluttered. Hermione shook her head, laughing. "You sure about that?" said Veronica, now smirking at the red-faced Draco. "Because just yesterday I caught a second-year pinch a girl's arse, and when I confronted him about it, his excuse was, 'But Professor Malfoy did it to Professor Granger, and he didn't get detention.'" Hermione continued to shake her head, smiling still. Nothing could ruin her mood right now. She glanced over at Draco, who had started choking again, and poured him a goblet of water, humming to herself once more. Neville arrived at the table then, wiping the dirt on his hands on his robes, and came to a full stop when he saw Hermione. "Uh-oh." "Have a seat, Neville," she said cheerfully. "They have shepherd's pie tonight, your favorite." Slowly and carefully, keeping an eye on her the entire time, Neville lowered himself onto his chair on the other side of Draco. "Hermione, what did you do?" he asked in a voice so low only the four of them could hear. "I haven't seen you like this since you put Rita Skeeter in a jar." "You what?" Half the students in the hall snapped their heads to stare at Draco. But with a stern look from Hermione and another from Minerva, they went back to eating. Hermione turned back to Draco and gently shut his mouth for him. "How the fuck do you put a woman in a jar?" Veronica whispered urgently. Hermione glared at Neville, who gave her a sheepish smile. "I told you that in confidence, Neville Longbottom," she snapped, before sighing and meeting Veronica's shocked gaze. "She's an unregistered animagus, a beetle, and I didn't quite like the things she was writing about Harry and I. Though I believe you already knew this about her, didn't you, Draco?" she added, raising an eyebrow at him, "seeing as you and the other Slytherins were feeding her information all of fourth year." Draco's mouth had fallen open again. At that, he hastily shut it and slumped back in his chair, looking as though he'd been told his entire life was a lie. Hermione shook her head in exasperation. "I only kept her in the jar for about a month," she said, "just until she learned her lesson. When I released her, I made sure she knew that if she ever wrote about Harry or I without our express permission again, I would turn her in for being an illegal animagus." Veronica whistled. "Damn," she muttered. "Remind me not to get on your bad side, Hermione." This statement made Hermione smile, though she wasn't sure what that said about her. She took a long sip of pumpkin juice, then said brightly, "Anyway, I was fed up with the way the students were acting, so I gently reminded them who exactly they were speaking to." Neville frowned. "And by gently, you mean—" "I meant what I said." "You alive over there, Draco?" asked Veronica, to which she received no response. "Draco? Draco!" "Huh?" Hermione narrowed her eyes at him, which seemed to make him extremely nervous. He was still slumped in his seat and looked more pale than usual. She laid a hand on his shoulder and gave him a questioning look, silently asking him if he was all right. Draco startled and jerked away from her, quickly getting to his feet. He wiped his palms on his trousers as though they'd gotten sweaty, and nodded at them all. Essays to mark," he stammered, and he walked straight out of the great hall, loosening his tie as he went. "What's got his wand in a knot?" asked Veronica. Hermione shrugged, frowning. "I don't know." Hermione's good mood carried on to the next day, her 24th birthday. It was a little strange, feeling good on her birthday. She hadn't really enjoyed it too much the last years. She'd spent her 22nd birthday drinking alone in her flat in Venice, unaware that Ron and Lavender were currently exchanging vows. By her 23rd birthday, those she worked with had caught on, and she spent nearly the entire day in bed with Malcolm. Strangely enough, she'd still felt lonely and had hidden in the bathroom at one point so he wouldn't see her crying. But on this day, she slipped in, taking her time to stretch her limbs while sunlight flooded into her bedroom, warming her. She started her morning with a long shower, and Creature had a glorious spread of breakfast items waiting at her little table for her when she was done, along with 2 letters and a small package. She sat down, humming to herself, and fixed herself up a cup of tea before opening the first letter. Victor Crumb had written to wish her a happy birthday. She smiled a little at that. She'd managed to see him once during her time away. He'd had a match in Rome the previous August, and though she'd refused to attend the match itself and risk being photographed, she had gone back with him to his hotel that night to help celebrate his capture of the snitch. She'd spent the next several weeks fantasizing about sending Ron a memory, just out of spite. But she didn't need any more people knowing the details of her sex life. The second letter was from Ginny, who claimed that she was throwing her a birthday party that night at she and Harry's house, and that she would be doing so against Hermione's will if need be. The letter contained a guest list, for which Hermione was grateful. She didn't want any more surprises. Ginny told her that she and Neville would be meeting George in Hogsmeade at 5 o'clock, seeing as he was there setting up a new branch she'd recently purchased for Weasley's Wizard Wheezes. Hermione had been assured that Ron would not be there. He would be busy celebrating his wedding anniversary anyway. The package contained a pack of sugar quills and a note from Malcolm that left Hermione a little breathless, and that she had to hide in one of her books before anyone else spotted it. She was still pink-faced when she went to fix her hair and makeup in the bathroom mirror, lost in thought about all the things he'd written. She may have never had romantic feelings for Malcolm, but he'd certainly had her feeling other things Ron had never managed. It was nearly noon when Hermione finally left her quarters, wearing a skin-tight and sleeved maroon dress and knee-high brown leather-heeled boots, and sucking on a sugar quill. The color maroon had really grown on her since her split with Ron. Not wanting to do any marking or lesson planning that day, she wandered outside towards the greenhouses in search of Neville. When she opened the big oak front doors, however, she first found Draco lighting up a cigarette. In the middle of the courtyard. In front of students. She strutted up to him, tapping him on the shoulder to get his attention, opening her mouth to scold him good and proper for being such a bad influence to the younger years. But the second he turned to look at her, he staggered backward to get away. With a huff, Hermione removed her wand from her boot, vanished the cigarette, which made him scowl. "Have you forgotten that there are children around?" she said snappishly. "Young, naive, and impressionable children." She tucked her wand away and went back to sucking on her sugar quill while she waited his response. Only Draco just stared at her, his mouth hanging slightly open. She raised an eyebrow at him, and he seemed to come back to himself. "Get that thing out of your mouth," he said, looking deeply unsettled. Hermione released the sugar quill with a pop, and Draco nearly flinched. She put her free hand on her hip and glared at him. "What is wrong with you?" she said hotly. "Why are you acting so strange?" "I'm not acting strange," he said at once. "There are children around, like you said. You shouldn't be sucking on that thing." "I beg your pardon." Draco opened his mouth irritably, then hastily shut it and shook his head. With a great huff, he turned on his heel and stomped back into the castle, leaving her standing there slightly annoyed. Not even a happy birthday. With a huff of her own, she stomped off towards the greenhouses, ignoring the odd looks some of the students were giving her. She found Neville in Greenhouse 2, and funnily enough, Veronica was there as well, procuring her ingredients she'd need for some of her upcoming lessons. Neville gave her a great big hug the second he spotted her, and promised she'd receive her gift later that day, when they were at the Potters'. Veronica proceeded to make a huge fuss about how her mother was forcing her to meet a friend of the family that evening, and couldn't come herself. "If I manage to get away, however," she said seriously, as she took a clipping of fluxweed from Neville and placed it in a small vial, "I'm coming straight there and drinking until I don't remember my own name." "I take it you aren't a fan of this friend?" asked Hermione, perching on the desk. Veronica waved the question away as though it were a particularly irksome fly. "Oh, please," she said. "I haven't the slightest clue who it is, but I sure as shit know why I'm meeting them." Hermione gave her a questioning look. "Marriage, Hermione!" Veronica shouted, angrily waving the vial in her face. Behind her, Neville sighed, and Hermione got the impression she'd heard this many times. "My mother has been dragging me out to dinner every few months for the last year to meet suitor after suitor, always saying things like, 'Just because Zacharias got a wife doesn't mean you're off the hook,' and 'You don't want to end up like this Malfoy boy, do you, Ronnie?' The woman won't leave me the fuck alone." She stuffed the vial violently into her pocket, and Neville cringed. "Zacharias got a wife and a baby on the way," Veronica went on, now waving her hands around and forcing Neville to duck, lest he be hit in the face. "There's their fucking heir! Why is it so important for me to be married off to some great pure-blood prick when they've already gotten the heir? I mean, don't get me wrong. Not all of the men my mother's introduced me to are awful. Some of them are even pretty nice. But you know what? It's just never going to work out. Why? Because I like cunt. Hermione was at a loss for words. She tried to think of something comforting to say, or perhaps a bit of advice that she could give, but alas, she could come up with nothing. So she just went back to sucking on her sugar quill. Veronica snorted. I used to eat those all the time in front of Zacharias and I's tutor, she chortled. Her bad mood gone so fast it nearly gave Hermione whiplash. Made him so uncomfortable. No wonder my parents thought I was straight. I used to flirt with the men just for shits and giggles. Hermione paused, realizing exactly how she looked in the moment, and then immediately tossed her sugar quill in the rubbish bin next to the desk. You should talk to Draco about this, she said, sighing slightly. He'd probably be able to give you some advice. You know, if he wasn't currently acting like such a massive prat. Neville looked up at her so quick that he cricked his neck. Rubbing the sore muscles, he asked, Did he say something to you? Do we need to speak to Minerva? She shook her head at once. No, nothing like that, she said. He actually hasn't said a thing about my blood since we both started working here. Neville let out a sigh of relief and returned to the venomous tentacula he was currently tending to. Veronica, on the other hand, gestured for her to go on. He's just being weird, said Hermione, rolling her eyes. I ran into him on the way here, and, I mean, maybe I shouldn't have expected anything, but we're sort of friends now, so I just thought maybe he'd at least wish me a happy birthday. Instead, the prat just snapped at me and stormed off. He's probably just pissed you managed to get control of your students, said Veronica smartly, while his still hate him. I mean, even the ones who wish Voldemort was never defeated hate him for not stepping up as the head of the house of Malfoy. That's hardly my fault. Of course not. I never said his anger was justified. Veronica rolled her eyes, apparently exasperated. But it's not like he can go all Snape on them. The first and second years are already afraid of him. Losing his temper will only make things worse. Hermione crossed her arms, frowning. She didn't particularly like it when someone had to point something out to her that she should have already known, and Veronica was right. There was no way Draco could so much as raise his voice at his students, without proving them right about his being evil. She would have to do something about that. Well, she thought irritably, she'll do something about it if he stops giving her attitude. She didn't see him again, however, until she and Neville were leaving to meet George Weasley in Hogsmeade. They were walking in the direction of Zonko's joke shop, the sign had yet to be changed, where George was waiting for them, and Hermione spotted Draco a little further down the street with Blaise Zabini. She raised her hand to wave at him, but didn't get a chance to see whether or not he waved back, because she was then lifted off her feet and being swung around by a burly redhead with only one ear. "Thank fuck you're home!" yelled George, and she laughed loudly, wrapping her arms around his neck. "If you make a run for it like that again, I'm coming after you and dragging you back by your hair. Got it?" "I missed you too, George," chortled Hermione, pressing a kiss to his cheek. He set her down on her feet and made her spin around so he could get a good look at her. "What?" "Just confirming that my brother's an idiot," said George simply. "And he is." Hermione slapped his chest playfully, giggling a little. He chuckled, throwing an arm around her shoulders, and nodded to Neville. She glanced back to where she'd seen Draco to find him glaring at Zabini, who was bent over laughing. Odd. "Come on, you two, let's go," said George briskly. "We've got plenty of catching up to do, and I've got a bottle of Ogden's finest with your name on it, Hermione." Oh, God. The three of them traveled by apparition to a large cottage outside the town of Ottery St. Catchpole. It made Hermione slightly wary to be so close to the burrow, but Ginny had promised that she, George, and his wife Angelina would be the only Weasleys present. The new house she and Harry had purchased was larger than any of the other wizarding homes in the area, but still looked warm and welcoming. It was made up of white-painted bricks, large windows, a giant porch, and was covered almost entirely with ivy. A miniature Quidditch pitch was set up in the yard for little James, surrounded by a slightly overgrown garden that Hermione suspected was full of gnomes they didn't bother getting rid of. The front door was suddenly thrown open, and she caught a glimpse of Ginny leaping off the front porch, before she was enveloped in a warm hug. "Happy birthday!" Ginny grinned. "Thanks, Ginny," she said, and the moment she was released, Harry was suddenly there to give her a hug of his own. "Hi, Harry." "Happy birthday, Hermione," he said kindly. He took a step back to smile at Neville and George behind her before meeting her gaze again. "James and Albus are at the Burrow tonight, Molly was already looking after Rose, Fred, and Roxanne, so we figured 2 more kids wouldn't make so much of a difference for her. You're going to have to come back soon, though, said Ginny strictly, her hands on her hips. You've got a godson to meet, and another that's very put out he hasn't seen you yet. We'll find a time soon. How about that? Said Hermione, grinning still, and the Potters nodded vigorously. Until then, I'd like to see some pictures if you have them. That shouldn't be a problem, said George, smirking. Harry here takes pictures of everything, and I mean everything. Bloke's got a photograph of Al drooling all over himself in his wallet, and another of James with a pot on his head. Real charmer, that one. Harry rolled his eyes while everyone laughed and grabbed Hermione by the arm, leading her inside the house. I'm just trying to capture everything so they have photos to look back on one day, he said feebly. I don't take pictures of everything. Hermione gave him a little pat on the arm, smiling. I'm sure you don't, Harry. 3 hours and 4 glasses of fire whiskey later found Hermione tearing through her birthday presents like a 6-year-old on Christmas morning. She sat cross-legged on the floor of the Potters' sitting room with Luna and Ginny on either side of her, tearing wrapping paper off and leaving the floor around them a mess. She chuckled nervously at the anti-Raxburgh perfume Luna had given her, and then had to be held back by Ginny when she opened George and Annalina's gift, only wound up coughing on purple smoke. Neville had given her a very nice set of red ink quills for grading essays, and Harry and Ginny had gotten her a first-edition copy of Hogwarts, a History. There was also a package of fudge from Hagrid with a note wishing her a very happy birthday that made her heart melt a little. After gifts, she stumbled into the kitchen for a refill, while Ginny gave a very accurate and equally disturbing impression of her mother singing Celestina Warbeck. She was laughing and nearly tripped over a dustpan that was left on the floor. Clutching the table for support, she managed to steady herself and stood still a minute, waiting for the room to stop spinning. The surface of the table was littered with bottles of fire whiskey, wine, and sherry, thick case files from Harry's work that should have been kept elsewhere, and bowls of various snacks that George had charmed blue and no longer looked entirely appetizing. Shaking her head, Hermione began to carefully move the food and drink to retrieve Harry's work and move it to the counter so it wouldn't get spilt on. It was while lifting a particularly large file labeled Confidential that she came across that morning's edition of the Daily Prophet. There, on the front page, was a photograph of both Ron and herself dancing at Harry and Ginny's wedding, under the headline, Bitter Ex-Lovers Back and Out for Blood. He was wearing a pair of handsome navy dress robes that were a perfect match to the bridesmaid's gown she wore, and they were smiling at each other. A certain look in their eyes that hadn't been there in a very long time. Lavender could be seen in the background, watching them. Hermione reached for the bottle of Ogden's George had given her and took a long swig, all the while staring at the photograph. She stumbled backwards blindly until she hit one of the cupboards and sank to the cool, tiled floor. There was a pain in her chest that hadn't been there in almost a year. It wasn't that familiar anger or bitterness at the way things had ended, or how he had treated her, or even at how he had single-handedly managed to turn her life upside down. It was just hurt. Hurt because she had spent most of her life loving him more than she loved herself. Hurt because she had been forced to learn how to live without him. Hurt because she hadn't known who she was without him and Harry. She had spent the last 2 years of her life trying to figure out how to be on her own, but she wasn't on her own anymore. Ron was out there somewhere with Lavender. He had a daughter now, a family. She wondered if he had to learn how to live life without her too. Maybe it was easier for him because he had Lavender. Hermione had finished almost the entire bottle before Harry found her. He took one look at the paper at her lap and sighed. You shouldn't have to look at that stuff, Hermione, he said sadly. She merely shrugged and glanced back down at the photograph. A teardrop fell on the page and it startled her. She wasn't aware that she'd been crying. Harry took the prophet from her and tossed it on the table before crouching down in front of her. He reached out and wiped away some of her tears, giving her a grim smile. I didn't want you to have to think about him, he said quietly. Tonight was supposed to be about you. I just want you to be happy, Hermione. You know that, right? Hermione nodded, sniffling. There was a great whooshing sound from the next room, followed by uneven footsteps, and she heard Ginny shout, her voice more furious than Hermione had ever heard it. Get the fuck out! Harry's back went ramrod straight, and Hermione frowned at him, confused. Then, at the sound of George's voice, all air left her lungs. You were told not to come here tonight, Ron,